Good morning and happy Sabbath. This morning I'd like to take you on a journey in the Old Testament and draw a comparison between a practical lesson that Jesus taught the disciples in the New Testament and what has been so popularly discussed and referred to in the Old Testament, and see how that translates for you and I today, for our daily life. And that lesson is the lesson of a vineyard. Many of you have seen a vineyard, right? Beautiful branches that just swing out and extend for many feet, and they bring beautiful, delicious fruit that we love to eat, right? We don't often think how the fruit is being grown. We generally tend to resort to how it is being displayed in the supermarket. However, the vineyard is a beautiful illustration that is referred to in the Old and in the New Testament. And I'd like to give you some statistics that the first largest recorded grapevine was planted in 1842 in California. And by 1900, it yielded more than 9 tons of grapes. The vine died later in 1920. But can you imagine this vineyard planted in 1942, and by 1900, over 9 tons of grapes. Okay? The Britain's grapevine, with a girth of 38 inches and branches spreading 110 feet, was planted in 1768, yielded an average of 1,200 pounds per year. That's over half a ton. Can you imagine? Okay? And then lastly, the smaller vine spread over an area of 200 square feet, or a little bit over an acre. The Kippon vine in Scotland is claimed to have covered 8 acres, which would have probably been similar to the largest recorded vine in California. But this is nothing compared to the vine and the fruit that the spies brought back from the land of Canaan. Let's read about them in Numbers chapter 13 verse 23. Let's read about these spies. What did they bring back from the land of Canaan? Numbers 13 verse 23. And they came unto the brook of Eshcol, and cut down from thence a branch with 1 cluster of grapes, and they buried between 2 upon a staff, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. So here we have this incredible vine. This statistical examples that I gave you of a vineyard that have the vineyards that have been planted in both California and Britain and Scotland, but they compare nothing against this vine that the 12 spies brought back, right? What a harvest the vines in Canaan produced. It is amazing. Yet that is nothing compared, even that in its all beauty is nothing compared to the fruit of the Lord that the Lord would have us produce today. The fruit that the Lord wishes you and I to produce today. God tells us of the vineyard He had selected. And this is what we'll be discussing today. The vineyard He has selected, cultivated for a special purpose. We opened by reading 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9. I'm not going to read it yet, we'll come back to it, but this is generally a verse we are often hearing and we often refer to, right? We often hear, "Oh, you're a special people. You're God's special people." This morning I'd like to, with the use of the Bible and the illustration of the vine, to identify how does it mean, or what does it really mean that we are a special people. Okay? And for that, we need to go back to Isaiah. Remember, I will be taking Old Testament, comparing to the New Testament, because it will give us the full sense or the complete picture. In Isaiah chapter 5, starting with verse 1, we have an illustration that is given to us by prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1. What do we have written here? Isaiah 5:1. Now I will sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. And he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a vine presser therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. I'll stop here. Verse 1 and 2 so far. What did we read here? It's referring to a vinery, but there's a couple key elements that I want you to pay attention. Number one, the vineyard was planted in a fruitful hill. It was fenced. Stones were gathered out of it. It was planted with the choicest vine, and a tower was set in the midst of it. These are all crucially important in us having a complete picture when we go to the New Testament and we see how each one of these attributes actually have a meaning. Now I'd like to read also verse 4 through 7. In the same chapter, chapter 5, verse 4 through 7. Let's continue reading. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes? And now go I will tell you that I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the all thereof, and it shall be trodden down. Verse 6, and I will lay it waste, and it shall not be pruned, nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. And I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. Verse 7, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, but behold, oppression, for righteousness, but behold, a cry. I'll stop here. Okay, so we have this beautiful picture painted at the beginning of a vineyard covered up, prepared, separated, just all ready to just harvest and enjoy the fruit, one would think. But then we read that what type of fruit did it bring? Wild grapes. And because it brought wild grapes, what is it told in verse 4 through 7? That the hedge was removed, that what else was happened here? That it was trodden down, it was no longer watered, it was no longer being kept up and taken care of. First things first that we need to understand is that the vineyard represents the Jewish nation. It represents God's people at that time, right? I'd like to go a little bit back to Exodus chapter 19 verse 5. Go back to nearly the beginning. In Exodus, second book of the Bible, chapter 19 verse 5. Know what we read here. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Here Jesus has made a proclamation that he had separated unto him this people, the Jewish people, but he has given them a condition. Did you notice? Very subtle, right at the beginning. What did it say here? If ye will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant. So here, now we're beginning to paint a picture that the vineyard of the Lord is likened to the people of Israel, and they would have been kept up and maintained and watered and protected with a hedge as long as they did what? Kept God's covenant, right? And what else does it say here? And obeyed his voice. All right. Now we're beginning to paint a picture, right? That we read 4 through 7 where it says that I will remove my hedge and I will destroy. And it seems like God is just this unrighteous God that just mean. But he's not. There was a condition. Okay? We'll come to this in just a little bit. In Christ Object Lessons, page 285, COL 285. The husbandman chooses a piece of land from the wilderness. He fences, clears, and tills and plants it with the choice vines. And plants it with the choice vines, expecting a rich harvest. This plot of ground, in its superiority to the uncultivated waste, he expects to do him honor by showing the results of his care and toils in his cultivation. Okay? This just further illustrates and emphasizes what happened. Now, let's go to Deuteronomy, chapter 7, verse 5 through 7. Let's continue this thought that we began opening up in Exodus chapter 19. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 5 through 7. But thus shall he deal with them. He shall destroy their altars, and break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire. For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God, and the Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself. Above all people that are upon the face of the earth, the Lord did not set his love upon you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any people, for you were fewer of all people. Notice here, God had chosen the people of Israel not because they were greater or superior in numbers or wisdom or intelligence or cultural development or anything. He had chosen them to be a peculiar people simply because He loved them and He had tried them and they proved to Him that they can in fact obey His voice. Okay? Now, so this vineyard represents custodianship. God's called, and God calls upon us, people of Israel, actually, we were still talking about them, to bear responsibility, given that they had the special privileges and they have been set aside. Okay? So what does that mean for me today? Those that have children. Right? When you give them something, when you send them to school, when you give them an opportunity to excel in something, there's certain demand, right? There's certain expectations that I as a parent want or you as a parent want from your child, right? A teacher, when he goes through a certain set of materials, he gives them a quiz. He expects the students to know his material. Similarly with God. I'd like to continue the paragraph I read earlier from Christ Object Lessons, page 286 to 87. 286 to 87, Christ Object Lesson. So God hath chosen a people from the world to be trained and educated by Christ. I'm skipping some parts. As the Lord's vineyard, they were to produce fruit altogether different from that of of heathen nations. It was the privilege of the Jewish nation to represent the character of God. Through the Jewish nation, it was God's purpose to impart rich blessings to all people. Through Israel, the way was to be prepared for the diffusion of His light to the whole world. What does it say here? God had chosen people of God and He had trained them and educated them to be a special people. Just like a vineyard is being pruned and upkept and maintained and hedged and watered, God had done so with His people, the people of Israel. Okay? They were given a privilege unlike anyone at that time. What evidence do we have that He had given them this privilege? Did you notice that they did not have to fight a single war and actually have their men die in a single war until they became disobedient and then they went on and fought wars on their own? Did you notice that? Did you notice they won Canaan and occupied a land without a single Israelite being dead? However, when they began disobeying God's voice, the small city of Ai, what happened? Man died because they were disobedient. I would like to read one more paragraph along the same lines. Christ Object Lessons 288. Christ Object Lessons 288. If obedient, they, meaning Israel, would be preserved from the diseases that afflicted other nations and would be blessed with vigor and intellect. The glory of God, His majesty and power were to be revealed in all their prosperity. For there were to be a kingdom of priests and princes. God furnished them with every faculty for becoming the greatest nation on the earth. What do we hear today on the news? We want to be the greatest nation. Russia, China, Brazil, United States, all these, they're battling, to become great. But what are we missing? And similarly to the people of Israel, disobedience to the voice of God. And we'll get to that in just a few moments. So, the Jewish nation, who today, back then disobeyed God's commandments, were taking away those privileges, right? Were taking away those responsibilities of being kings and priests. However, it's enough talking about Israelites and what they did wrong. How about us today? As an individual, as a church, and as a nation. How do we today find ourselves in a similar pitfalls of the Israel nation? So we earlier identified that the Jewish nation were set up to be a peculiar people on the condition of obedience and listening to the voice of God. Christ Object Lessons, page 296, 297, it's along the same lines where we've been reading up until now. It says, these principles are to be manifested in the individual Christian, in the family, in the church, and in every institution established for God's service. All are to be symbolic of what can be done for the world. They are to be types of the saving power of the truths of the gospel. All are agencies in the fulfillment of God's great purpose for the human race. I'd like to stop here. So here now we're taking a step back and now we're beginning to see ourselves. That not only were Israelites having their responsibility, because what gave them the responsibility? What set them aside? Presence of God. Today you and I have the presence of God and have that responsibility. Notice it said here three things. To manifest in the individual Christians, meaning me personally, in the family, those that are closest to me, in the church, those that I associate with, once or twice a week, and in the institutions, meaning schools, colleges. Okay? They were there to be established for God's service. So this is it. God today is calling us to be a special people. And when we refer to 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9, we hear this verse being quoted repeatedly in telling us that you're a special people, we tend to think of ourselves as such. We are special. However, we forget the criterion that made these people in people of Israel separate, which was the presence of God, listening to His covenant and listening to His voice. This was the criterion that separated and made them special. Not in the fact that they were the special people, because in themselves they possessed nothing special. We already read that, right? It was the combination, it was the presence of Jesus is what made them special, okay? I'd like to read one more paragraph and then we'll move on. In Testimonies to Ministers. Testimonies to Ministers, I'm reading from Testimonies to Ministers, page 16 and 17. His, meaning God's authority, should be kept distinct and plain before the world, and no laws are to be acknowledged that come in collision with the laws of Jehovah. In the defiance of God's arrangements, the world be allowed to influence our decisions or our action. the purpose of God is defeated. So notice here, if in defiance of God's arrangements, we allow the world to influence us through circumstances, the purpose of God is defeated. God's purpose. God's purpose is to make us a special people, to be radiating His light, His love, His ministry, His compassion. And when we fail to do those types of things, as it said here, the purpose of God is defeated. You know, a salt is supposed to salt or make the food salty, right? Those of us that are in a season, right? That are in the culinary, that are familiar with the kitchen. What happens if the salt gets either moist or becomes wet? It defeats its purpose for seasoning a dish, right? We're all familiar. We've all had salt that we saw get a little moist, or maybe water dripped and then the salt becomes no good. Okay? Now, do you remember? I'll come back to it in just a minute. Let's now go to Titus. In the New Testament, remember, I want to take you from the Old Testament and tell you what was the initial plan, and then compare with the New Testament how that initial plan, initial agenda is being executed. Nothing changed. The purpose did not change from the very beginning, from Eden. The purpose did not change. It's the same. I want to now compare how that purpose is being fulfilled in the New Testament. And we already read 1 Peter 2:9, and that we're still those peculiar people. But now Titus chapter 2 verse 14. In the book of Titus chapter 2 verse 14, notice what it says here. Who gave Himself for us that He might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto Himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. So wait a minute. That whole concept, that whole purpose that was the underlying purpose of the existence of the people of Israel is still applicable in the New Testament. Right? Notice what it says here. Peculiar people, zealous of good works. This is so fascinating when you compare the Old and the New Testament and you see how it makes sense that those types of works that the Israelites were called and asked to do were never lifted, were never taken away. The statute of limitation on good works or on your obedience to God was never lifted. Unlike people today believe that just because Jesus was nailed to the cross, I no longer have to do anything. Right? The concept of good works is still as applicable today as it has been to Israelites. Now, we will get to this a little bit more in that how are these good works to be executed? How are they to be completed, fulfilled in my life today, in the life of a church? Not through our own strength and power, but it is through Jesus. I'll get to that in just a minute. Now, do you remember when we were reading Isaiah chapter 5, I mentioned those key attributes that, and I called them out. One of them was the tower. Do you remember that? Right? The tower was built, a hedge was built around the vineyard, and a tower was built right in the middle. Right? Do you recall that? Isaiah chapter 5 verse 1 and 2, if you want to go back and read that. What does the tower represent? As the tower in the vineyard, God placed in the midst of the land His holy temple. The church is the tower. Right? Why do you go to the tower? Protection from all harms and danger. But now we go to worship and to protect us from the surrounding, because these are the people that think alike, whose intention is not to hurt you, deceive you, or otherwise do a mischievous thing to you. Right? These are the like-minded people. That's where you go for protection and to worship. Desire of Ages, page 596. Desire of Ages, page 596, it says, in the parable, this householder represents God. The vineyard, the Jewish nation. The hedge, the divine law, which was their protection. The tower was a symbol of the temple. The Lord of the vineyard had done everything needful for its prosperity. God's people were to honor Him by a life corresponding to their sacred privileges. Did you follow that with me? Do you remember in Isaiah I emphasized every bit of or every attribute, and I paused on all of these things? The householder represents God, the man who found this place, who found this plot of land, who intends to make something out of it. The vineyard, God's people, at that time Jewish nation, but we'll come back a little bit and provided we have the time, maybe we leave it for the next for part 2, we will identify how did the vineyard Jewish nation fail to be who they were initially set out to be. The hedge, the divine law, it protects us from harm and danger. It protects us from killing someone, from being killed. It protects us from cheating on someone, from being cheated on. It protects us, it gives us the Sabbath, okay? And the tower is a symbol of the temple. It's where you go for protection and is where you go to worship with like-minded people, all right? So this is it, brethren. I'm overemphasizing, but I cannot stress enough the importance of understanding the Old Testament, because New Testament is based on the Old Testament. Notice how it translates. All of it is nearly verbatim, point by point. It connects Old and New. Okay. Now, moving on. Let's jump now to Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 4. We're now discussing the concept of a tower and the concept of a hedge. So, what is found in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 4? Jump with me to Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 4. Trust ye not in lying words, saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. The temple of the Lord are these. Wait a minute. Now this takes a different mindset, different shift, right? It now tells us, or it begins to open up a scene that the temple of the Lord that the Israelites have become so proud of, a physical thing, something that they have begun to worship. And now Jesus is taking that away, and He further explains and emphasizes that the temple is not necessarily a physical building. Okay? But it is a mindset. It is a combination. It is a joint body of people that are like-minded. Remember, I already said that once earlier. Okay? Now, in Great Controversy, page 596, in Great Controversy, GC 596, the spirit which actuated those priests and rulers is still manifested by is still manifested by many who make a high profession of piety. They refuse to examine the testimony of the scriptures concerning the special truths for this time. They point to their own numbers, wealth, and popularity, and look with contempt upon the advocates of the truth as few, poor, and unpopular, having a faith that separates them from the world. Great Controversy, page 596. So what does it say here? This explains Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 7. Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 4, pardon me, right? We read the temple, Israelites would yell out, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And Jesus said, no, the temple of the Lord are these. Who are these? The people of God. And notice here, these who have yelled, the temple of the Lord, refuse to examine their testimony and the testimony of the scripture concerning the special truth. They point to their own numbers, wealth, and popularity. What were the Israelites proud of concerning the temple? What were they bragging in terms of the temple? The beauty, the magnificence, and rightfully so. It was unlike anything that we see today. We go to the most beautiful place, the most wonderfully erected structure, and it is nothing compared to what the temple was. Rightfully so. They had a right to be, they possibly had a right to be proud of their work. However, they lost the meaning that it was not the temple, it was not a structure, a building that was magnificent, but the presence of Jesus Christ within. Okay? Now, as you noticed, the title is discussing, or the title is referencing the Vineyard of the Lord and Laodicea. Why would I choose to compare the two seemingly unrelated topics? Because the same principle, the same concept that Israelites exhibited and what led ultimately to the refusal of them as a nation is present in our day and age, in the time of Laodicea, as illustrated in Revelation chapter 3 verse 17. So now let's take a little shift, nearly a dynamic shift from just thinking of a practical and physical temple, vineyard, and so forth, to a more of a conceptual understanding, right? Are you with me? Okay? Go with me to Revelation chapter 3 verse 17. What does it say there? Because thou sayest, I'm rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Now, we had spent 2 Sabbaths talking about Laodicea, right? My dad went through the 7 churches and spent 2 Sabbaths on Laodicea. Rightfully so, because the attitude of the Laodicean people is as evident today as it has been in the time of Israelites, and is what ultimately led them to what it did. Remember, in Great Controversy I just read, Israelites were proud of their numbers, wealth, and popularity. What does Revelation 3:17 refer to? Thou thinkest thou sayest, I'm increased with rich, I'm rich, increased with goods, and have need of nothing. Do you see the parallel? Nearly the same words, maybe synonyms or something similar to that is being substituted here in the New Testament to what is being referenced to and referred and is used to describe the Israelite nation in the Old Testament. And this is the connection. This is the connection between the vineyard of the Lord, the principle that made the vineyard of the Lord special, the principle that would allow them to maintain that special peculiarity, right? And when they removed that principle, what happened to them? They were destroyed, they were being taken captive, and so forth. Okay? Now, moving forward, the failure to fulfill God's purpose was evident in the lives of Israelites. And that is unfortunate. However, it is as unfortunate that you and I today fail to fulfill God's purpose today as well. Wouldn't you agree? I know for me personally. And notice what it said in Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 21. Notice we go back and forth all the New Testament. Now Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 21. What does it say there? This prophecy is being foretold about the Israelites. Jeremiah 2:21. Yet I had planted thee a noble vine, wholly a right seed. But then art thou turned into the degenerate plant of a strange vine unto me? Notice what it says here of Israelites. It's echoing that beginning of Isaiah, right? Planted a good tree, a choice vine. It is hedged, protected, watered. But what type of grapes did they bring? Wild grapes. And what type of grapes does Jeremiah say that the people of God bring? Degenerate plant. It is a fascinating word. It's not one that you would commonly hear being referred to. We now refer to as a degenerate someone mentally ill. You know, someone that's like a degenerate, not even mentally ill, but maybe something so bad, right? I'd like to continue this thought and just further emphasize, and you will find, I believe you will find this at the back of your bulletin, the first paragraph from Christ Objects Lesson, page 287. To this people were committed the oracle of God. They were hedged about by the precepts of His law. Okay? The everlasting principles of truth, justice, and purity. Obedience to these principles was to be their protection, for it would save them from destroying themselves by sinful practices. So let's discuss this a little bit. The principles committed to these people were oracles of God. Okay? These principles, these oracles, were hedged about by precepts of His law. We spoke earlier, what does the hedge mean that was built around the vineyard? God's law. God's law was given us to keep us hedged, right? To keep us to protect us from others and others from us. Okay? Now, how are these principles simplified? They're simplified by 3 words: truth, justice, and purity. These are sort of like the basic principles of God's law, and God's love, which is truth. God loves truth. We tell our children, don't lie. No mentira. We say it from early age. Don't lie to me. That's the first thing parents tell their children. And above that, it's not something that parents even teach their children. I don't imagine anyone would teach their child to lie, right? It's something that they pick up on their own through their hereditary or cultivated tendencies, as we discussed in the Sabbath school this morning, right? But this is something that God wants us to eradicate, okay? So that's truth. Justice, doing the right thing. Doing, meaning actions. To do justly, meaning you're doing the right thing. And purity, meaning you have a pure thought, pure motive. You're doing it because you genuinely want to do the right thing. You have a pure motive for delivering justice. Do you see how this tie together? I'd like to read, I believe the next one is also in the back of your bulletin. Every spiritual advantage was given. God withheld from them nothing favorable to the formation of character that would make them representatives of Himself. Would you say that this note towards the children of Israel is not the first time that we see this being echoed in the Bible? And what do I mean by that? Adam and Eve, weren't they put in the position that everything was given them to what? To form their character and to make them representatives of Christ? So notice this sort of progression. There were Adam and Eve, they sinned. Then God punished them, then God chose Himself a people. He chose Noah and his family. Right? They were okay for a little while, and then after the flood, what happened to the children? They apostatized. Then God chose another man, another nation, then they apostatized. Then He chose Waldenses. They apostatized. Then He chose the Advent movement in 1940s. They unfortunately have left some of those oracles. I am not saying they apostatized. I want to be very careful. But they lost the oracles of God, meaning those basic principles. And now He has chosen Himself another special people, which is us. But if we fail to do the right thing and what God is calling us to do, we will be punished, and then He'll choose somebody else. Notice this sort of waving progression. Up, down, up, down, up, down, right? But it's a constant moving forward. Imagine this as an arrow pointing this direction, meaning that the progression is happening. And where will we find ourselves in terms of this, either downward position or upward position? I pray that we find ourselves at the upward position. Hosea chapter 10 verse 1. Now this is coming a little bit more to the present day. and the prophecy now, you see, these, what we call them, smaller prophets. They're not speaking of what has happened before. They're speaking of what will happen. Daniel, Hosea, and Micah, and so forth. Notice what is found in Hosea chapter 10, verse 1. Hosea 10:1. Israel is an empty vine. He bringeth forth fruit unto himself. According to the multitude of his fruit, he hath increased the altars. According to the goodness of his land, they have made goodly images. What a solemn and scary concept here. What a solemn and scary thought. Israel is an empty vine. Israel was not an empty vine just a few years back, just a little while ago when we read in Isaiah. Israel was a chosen vine. But now Israel is an empty vine. And notice what it says here. He bringeth forth fruit unto himself. Wild grapes and degenerate fruit is otherwise that is being referred to in Isaiah and Jeremiah. And now Hosea explains what is that type of fruit. What is a wild grape? What is a degenerate fruit? It's the type of fruit that you bring unto yourself. Okay? According to the multitude of his fruit, he hath increased the altars. Okay? This example, or this is illustrated to the children of Israel through a parable in the New Testament. The parable that is found in Matthew chapter 21. The parable of the vineyard. I want to at least give us a little glimpse, and maybe next time we will conclude this to bring us a full circle. Notice how God started with Adam and Eve and placed them in a favorable position to develop a character to be like Christ, like God, to replenish heaven. They failed. He had chosen a people of God, the nation, the Jewish nation, the Israelites, to then possibly complete that, but they also failed. Okay? And to illustrate this, he illustrated that in the Old Testament through a vineyard, something that the Israelites were most familiar with. And notice that in the New Testament, in Matthew 21, he goes back to the parable of the vineyard to re-explain or to re-emphasize or to connect the two dots that just like the Israelites were likened to a vineyard in Isaiah and failed to bring forth fruit and were cut down and destroyed, he now brings back the Pharisees and Sadducees to the same concept of a vineyard, that if they fail to produce fruit, they too will be cut out. Do you see the parallel? It is so fascinating when you compare the Old and the New Testament and you see how the same thing is echoed in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And it means the same thing for you and I today. Okay? I will not read that. I will stop here for time being. I will read 2 more paragraphs, but I want you to be attentive, and maybe when next time I'm given the privilege, I will compare, and actually what we'll do is read New Testament and then read Old Testament and match 1 to 1. You will see how it makes sense.
One reiterates the other.
That's right. One reiterates the other. Okay? I will conclude this morning's service with 2 paragraphs and a Bible verse. 1 paragraph and a Bible verse from Christ Object Lessons, page 303, 304. It's I'm selecting something from one page and something from the other. The professed followers of Christ are on trial before the heavenly universe. If what they are doing were the best they could do, condemnation would not rest upon them. What an interesting thought. If they are doing the very best they could do, condemnation would not rest upon them. Those of you that teach your children, and you teach your child to peel apples, right? And they begin to peel, and maybe they leave a little skin on the apple. Do you condemn your child? No! You take and gently teach them. You say, okay, take a knife, go slowly and make sure you cover every bit, don't miss anything. We want to make sure the apple is properly peeled. There's no condemnation. But if the child repeatedly does that, or as they grow old, they're an adult and they simply do it haphazardly or in a rush or not putting any thought or foresight into that, would you possibly have the right to be angry with him? Well, you can say, come on, you're an adult. You should know how to peel an apple. I'm using this very basic example to help us understand how God deals with us. When we were youth, when we were children, when we were Christian babes, God shows us to us how to peel an apple and He teaches us. But as we grow old, He wishes that we become good at peeling apples. So He does not have to go back after us and keep reminding us and keep telling us. And the verse that I will read to close the service is found in Romans chapter 11, verse 17, 20, and 21. Romans chapter 11, verse 17, 20, and 21. Romans 11, 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert graft in among them, and with them partakers of the root and fatness of the olive tree, jumping to 20 and 21. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest He also spare not thee. If God did not spare the beautiful vinery that has been invested in, that has been taken the time to dig and water and build all the things around it, and He destroyed it and left it alone, do not be deceived. God can do the same with us.
Amen.
I do not wish for us to think of this as a scary sermon or as a scary subject. It's not a sermon, it's a subject, it's a discussion, it's a study. But think of it as an inspirational study. That God wants you today and gives you the ability to change the type of fruit you bear. Not to have the wild fruit, or the degenerate fruit, but to have a fruit like the fruit of the Spirit. Amen.